It is great to see you at the Ford Foundation today. And on behalf of all of my colleagues here, I welcome you and thank you for being with us. To our friends and colleagues on OGP's outstanding Civil Society Steering Committee, to the co-chair, Sunita Kamal, who we'll hear from in a moment, to the co-chair, Rakesh Ranjani, who will be leading this morning's talk show discussion, to my colleagues, Martine Abregu and Jean Ross, and the great team in the Democracy, Rights, and Justice unit here at Ford, and to the foundation colleagues and partners, my friend Larry Kramer with the Hewlett Foundation, Open Society, and Omidyar, who have helped to provide some of the financial support to enliven and ensure that the work of this remarkable project advances. So at the Ford Foundation, we are very proud to be supporting OGP, your incredible, inspiring work on behalf of civil society. And we're hoping that this morning's frank, far-reaching conversation is just one more marker in the progress, the journey of progress that you are having. But before we begin, I want to just take a step back because I want to reflect. First, you guys look fabulous. This is an amazing moment. And sometimes you who work so hard and toil in the fields for social justice don't take a moment to just step back and be grateful for the progress that's been made because you're working so hard and you're running so fast. You don't take the time to do that. And I just want to say the progress that's been made here is remarkable. As of today, 64 countries voluntarily have affirmed the Open Government Declaration and agreed to participate in its mission. And we have seen that within these countries, leaders are subjecting themselves to independent, verifiable public monitoring as they set and achieve more rigorous transparency and accountability goals. And in this way, OGP's national action plans have made a meaningful difference in the lives of people. You've protected the public's right to information, you've ensured corporate accountability, and you've done so much more. But it doesn't mean that we now can rest on our laurels. We're in treacherous times, in rough waters, and real leadership that you are providing is needed more than ever. Because at the same time, beyond these 64 countries, as you know, we have seen an increase in the limits imposed on civil society. We, in fact, have seen new attempts to inhibit, to impede participation and oversight. So clearly, this troubling dynamic is among the greatest threats to social justice and social change. And the fact is, restrictive governments today are more likely to repress citizens, and unchecked powers are more often more unjust to their own people. So, together, we need to ask the questions. How can we use the powerful platform you've built against regimes and policies that restrict civil society's ability to operate? And how can we promote stronger legal and regulatory frameworks? Perhaps even through your national action plans? How do we think about carving out and protecting a space for civil society organizations so that they can flourish and make a difference in their communities and countries? And for our part, here at the Ford Foundation, we are very proud and indeed honored to stand behind and with and for civil society organizations, the true visionaries working on the front lines for social justice and human rights. And we are proud and honored again to stand with you in this room because you are creating a future in which all governments are accountable to their people, to their citizens, and you are delivering for those citizens and those communities. And with that, please allow me to introduce a remarkable person, inimitable and indefatigable Sunita Kamal.
Thank you, Darren, for that very kind introduction. I admit 8 a.m. meetings are much more pleasant when you are greeted with such wonderful remarks. Thank you also for your leadership and the support and engagement of your colleagues across Ford, which really enables civil society to play its critical role. I'd like to take a moment to introduce the current and incoming Civil Society Steering Committee members. Could I ask you to please stand at your table? Thank you. Thank you. I encourage you to seek out these individuals who have such tremendous experience and knowledge of the Open Government Partnership. It is truly my honor and my privilege to serve with them. I'd also like to thank all of you for your willingness to participate today. I imagine the first question on your mind is, can OGP really make a difference? I think it can, and I'd like to share my thoughts on why and how. When I was just 6 years old, I entered into my first contractual agreement. It was the product of rigorous negotiation between my mom and me, and included such contentious points as whether I would set or clear the dinner table and what time I would go to bed. The agreement was official, and I entered into the binding, albeit sticker-covered agreement as an informed agent. I had certain rights and responsibilities, and in turn, my mom was accountable to me. These elements remain critical in any social contract: the capacity to participate in informed dialogue, the availability of information to assess and weigh policy options, and an openness on the part of both parties to engage, each with a seat at the table. My organization, the Natural Resource Governance Institute, works in countries where the social contract is skewed. In resource-rich countries, power is concentrated in the hands of officials who allocate licenses and collect revenues. Unlike taxation, citizens play no part in the generation of these revenues, and so traditional accountability lines must be redrawn. The oil, gas, and mining sectors are complex and technical, and the players are powerful. In these countries, we at NRGI work to rebuild the social contract, to ensure that citizens have information about public resources that are being managed on their behalf. Who owns them, what's being paid for them, and where is that money going? In such contexts, multi-stakeholder initiatives like the Open Government Partnership have tremendous potential, not only to reinstate the social contract, but to also redefine it. Potential to put citizens and governments at the same table. Potential to provide space for civil society to not only play its role in holding governments to account, but also as experts who contribute to policy design and who amplify citizen voice. We have evidence that OGP can deliver on this potential. In countries where relations between government and civil society have historically been strained and no culture of dialogue exists, OGP has provided a forum for civic engagement. In Tunisia, one of OGP's newest countries, civil society and government officials are discussing policy priorities openly for the first time in living memory. In the field of natural resource governance, OGP has been a very useful platform to make concrete progress. Through OGP, countries as diverse as the US, Mexico, and Colombia have committed to implementing the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. In Kenya, civil society groups are actively engaged with government to develop policies regarding their oil and gas extraction. And in the UK, civil society organizations successfully advocated for a new OGP commitment to create a publicly accessible database with information on who controls and owns companies. OGP has also served to inspire action in countries not yet eligible to join. Malawi released both the executive's budget proposal and audit report in order to improve its fiscal transparency score and become eligible. Senegal passed a sweeping transparency law back in December 2012, which improved its score, but it still has work to meet the minimum threshold. And as part of widespread reform efforts, Myanmar has pledged to meet the eligibility criteria by 2016. My organization has helped to achieve some of these gains. It has required hard and frankly often mundane work. But what it has taught me is this: OGP will be as strong or as weak as we make it and allow it to be. We have the chance to be strategic, to be pragmatic, and to grab the OGP opportunity to advance our agendas. So as Darren said, let's talk about the how. How can we use OGP as a platform in better and smarter ways to achieve what we care about? Here are 3 suggestions. First, we can leverage the strengths and the reach of the civil society community to advance our collective aims. Around this room, we have people and organizations doing really important work to bring greater justice in the world. Imagine if the Transparency International, Publish What You Pay, the Tax Justice Network, the Access Initiative, and the Human Rights Movement all joined forces to advance a new norm of openness. If we leverage the breadth and the depth of these networks, we can more effectively caucus and coordinate around cross-cutting issues. And we can draw on a critical mass of advocates to serve as a tipping point in global processes. Second, we can use OGP to learn and to innovate. OGP is a space for experimentation about the way that we engage with government and the strategies that work to advance citizen priorities. Through OGP at the national, regional, and international levels, we have opportunities to share our knowledge and experience, to take stock of what's working, and to change tacks as needed. This exchange can occur between civil society organizations, across multi-stakeholder initiatives, and also reaching out to our government counterparts. It is an opportunity to take risks, to critically examine our own effectiveness and rigor, and to build our understanding of how we affect change. Third, we can use OGP to hold governments to account. As Darren notes, we face a very disturbing trend of closing space that threatens the very premise of OGP. In this room, we recognize that the rhetoric around openness and the multi-stakeholder nature of OGP stands in stark contrast to the realities faced by citizens and civil society on the ground. In too many OGP countries, restrictive laws and practices prohibit access to funding and political processes, freedom of expression, assembly, and operations, and contravene the basic principles of partnership. There are distinct roles for civil society to play, both within OGP and outside it, in order to halt the closure of civic space. At tomorrow's steering committee meeting, we will support the passage of a response policy that will enable concrete action to be taken when a country fails to live up to the OGP principles. Thereafter, we will need to be vigilant and make sure that the policy is implemented fairly, consistently, and meaningfully across the Open Government Partnership. The broader civil society community plays a critical role to monitor and raise awareness of closing space, to share information where civil society is precluded from the process. Where OGP can't engage, it can serve as a clearinghouse for information where other bodies can. Through OGP, we can continue to raise and empower domestic voices until we have turned the tide. At the same time, we can create, expand, and make more meaningful the space that does exist. A number of OGP countries have established a forum for ongoing dialogue with civil society partners. In other countries, like Argentina, OGP is one of the only areas where civil society and government are coming together to discuss policy priorities. We can build on this progress, articulate values, set up standards, build coalitions, and promote civic engagement with all the skill and creativity that we can muster all around the world. This work is absolutely the responsibility of civil society, but donors can play their part. Donors provide great value when they convene exchanges at the country, regional, and international level in events such as this one. They deliver critical financial support to do the homework, to encourage experimentation, and also to enable the long-term action that OGP requires. They also contribute intellectual capital to inform our programs. For example, the Transparency and Accountability Initiative, a donor collaborative, is doing truly valuable work to refine our understanding of how to measure and monitor civic space. The Open Government Partnership is not a sure bet, but it is up to us to make it a better bet. We are in a position to shape it, to promote it, to take risks, and to spur innovations, and to use it to ensure a little bit more justice for people around the world, all across different countries, sectors, and disciplines. That choice and the privilege is in our hands. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce my civil society co-chair, the fabulous, wonderful, talented, if you can come up with a fabulous adjective, it fits, Mr. Rakesh Rajani.
Good morning. Can we have our stars up here who are on the panel? Can you please come up? Robin, Georgie, Danny, and Paul. Please, hey, good to see you. Yeah. You know, when I was growing up in Mwanza, Tanzania, in the ages when the only connection to the world was radio, there was no internet, there wasn't really libraries and so on. I still remember very vividly how I got exposed to some organizations doing change in the world. And it's such a privilege for me because, well, Georgie's organization I know less, but the other three are right here with me. The first organizations, NGOs, really, that even the concept that I came across were Amnesty International and Oxfam. And it's through a lot of engaging with Oxfam, trying to write handwritten letters, learning about how they think, that I cut my first teeth in terms of thinking about justice and trying to do rights in the work. The first index that I ever grappled with in a serious way was the TI index. And I thought it was, what a fascinating idea that you can actually collect this data in a systematic way and compare and use it to put pressure. And Civicus is a group that I think from its early days when it was in Hungary, I used to try to engage with it. And in a pivotal moment when I was working in Tanzania for Haki Elimu and we were under great siege from government and they wanted to close us down, one of the groups that came out loud and clear and mobilized lots of global international support was Civicus. So to be able to sit here with these folks is like, you know, I get a rush. It's like, it's a really, really great pleasure for me. So thank you very much for being here. I want to introduce their names since you all have bios and I think you can read them. But I want to start with you, Georgie. You work on freedom of information, on media in your country. Give us a sense, tangible sense of what does that work involve and why does it matter?
Well, first of all, it's a great honor for me to be here and it's a great pleasure to sit together with you. And as you said, my organization is not that famous in comparison with my colleagues. And that's the opportunity to talk about this, what we are doing, because we are a local organization, we are not the international one. We started as the organization of just two persons who founded the organization as the organization to work on access to information and organization to work on the transparency of the archives. But we became one of the most well-known organizations working on freedom of information, transparency, accountability, and then we became the leading organization for working on open government partnership. We started, as I said, only as the organization to focus on little issues, but we became involved in global initiatives. We started to work on developing freedom of information, but now we are involved in working on drafting legislation which will improve freedom of information in Georgia, and we claim to be the ones who will lead the organization, who will be involved in developing freedom of information, not only locally in Georgia, but also to give the best practice internationally on legislation related to freedom of information. I would say we had the opportunity to work with the government on not only about the freedom of information, but what is the most important is the OGP. Because with our experience, with our expertise and professionalism, we managed to be involved directly in drafting the OGP action plans. So it's not that hard to be the organization who is leading the process, because government is trusting what we are recommending, and it's a great fun, you know, like when you feel how the process is developing, how you are involved in all these processes, and how your recommendations are provided. But we had a big group of organizations together with us. It was not only the IDFI who was developing. We had international organizations supporting our activities. We had local organizations and international organizations who are supporting the process. So with the advocacy work and giving the international examples was really effective in submitting and then advocating for the changes in Georgia. And I would say that we are reaching the highest standards in some of the issues. And we claim...
Sorry to interrupt. So I wanted to ask you, Georgia, specifically in terms of the OGP platform, if you're candid, is it something you've just joined, it's useful, or has it really added value? And if so, how?
Well, we used OGP as a platform for developing those of the principles that we are working on. Freedom of information, civic participation, developing technologies is the issue of the OGP, and these are what we are advocating for. We used OGP to develop the democratic processes in Georgia, and we have achieved a lot. Freedom of information is improved, and we have already implemented those of the commitments related to access to information, and now in the new action plan we are developing them even more. Because we are now changing, we are creating the reform of freedom of information. It's not just the amendment, but it's the whole reform of access to information. We are changing the culture, we are changing the mentality, and we are changing the philosophy in Georgia related to accountability and transparency. And this is done through the OGP. We use this international platform to advocate for such kind of novelties in Georgia, and this is a challenge. And this is really, I would say in Georgia we are feeling the changes, and when you are in the process of changing, you are in the process of these reforms, this is what motivates you to be even more active and work and advocate harder and harder.
Thank you, Georgie. That's a great testament. Robin, TI is a huge behemoth, all over the world, in many countries. Tell us some stories. This OGP thing, is it something that connects, that floats? Is it useful? Is it a footnote? What's your sense?
Well, it's interesting. When OGP came about, we were thinking, isn't this what we do already as TI? We work on procurement, we work on transparency and political finance, we work on a lot of the issues that are really core issues for open government. So the question, I think, for our network of chapters around the world was, what's the added value, and how can it give muscle and energy to the work we're already doing? And nevertheless, the chapter saw this as an opportunity, and I'm really here today because so many of them have been very active. We have 25 or 30 chapters that have been involved in national action plans. We have national chapters of our organization in about 59 of the OGP signatory countries, so we're really present on the ground. And since we like evidence, you mentioned our CPI, we did a SNAP survey last year to try to get some feedback from them on the process and on the content. And they really do see it as an opportunity. And overall, I think, as an opportunity to engage and to work with other civil society organizations. About a third of them said they hadn't worked on these kinds of issues in coalition before, so this is an opportunity for exchange, and we welcome that at all levels. There have been some really important local and regional alliances. So I have colleagues here today, and I'll shout out to them, and I hope that they can also speak to the things they work on. So in Mexico, for example, there's been a very concrete push toward transparency and funding, budgets around reconstruction in the wake of natural disaster. So all the way from allocating the federal budget to delivery on the ground, there's been a huge push forward. This is getting money out to people. And I think that's one of the messages from our chapter network. OGP has to have impact for people on the ground. We have to see how it impacts accountability for citizens and for a wide range of people. In Peru, there's an access to information law that's 10 years old. But the chapter in Peru, along with other civil society organizations, and there I'll mention Cecilia Blondet, who's here and joining the governance structure at OGP, have said we need an independent monitor of this law. And now it's coming in the next OGP action plan. So there's some really concrete ways that OGP has enabled new energy into those who fight corruption around the world.
So I'm really hearing two things, Robin, that the stuff that your chapters had been fighting for a long time, the OGP has given an opportunity for them to advance what they are doing anyway, but do it in a manner that involves coalitions and kind of advance that work forward. I want to come to you, Paul. Some of us look at Oxfam enviously as to how you guys do your international advocacy, and you connect this local, global in a way that there's some magic stardust. I'm not sure quite how you do it. So in that story, and in terms of how you think about real stuff on the ground and connecting it with the global narrative and global advocacy, is open government partnership useful in that regard?
Short answer, yes. I'm glad many of you haven't seen the sausage around how we get to our global campaigns, but it is exciting when we find that local to global story, and we think this is at the heart of what we're trying to be relevant to in lots of ways. We're trying to get 10 aspiring countries to join the platform. We're working with 36 others to try and leverage it. But, I was struck, Rakesh, listening to you, this word platform, it's dangerous because at the one level, it's nice. Martin did a nice blog the other day. It's the beginning of something, right? It's something on which you stand and build, and that's great. But it also connotes, we're here, come to us. And I'm fearful that if we collectively are not very dynamic about inserting this into other conversations that are going on, the power of this collective energy is not going to be unleashed. Many of us have been around Washington this week. Sorry for my sins, my head's still there. But we've been here in this great town asking how the hell we're going to pay for these sustainable development goals. I think the number $17 trillion a year has been put out there by intergovernmental experts because they're so huge, these 17 goals and 169 targets. And it's pretty clear it's not the old conversation. It's about whether governments are going to choose to spend this increasingly transparent money on the things that many of us collectively care about, right? And I was listening to Larry Summers the other night talk about the big money is going to be the $9.6 trillion that's going to be in government budgets due to growth. And so my question is how do we turn a money and power conversation into an open government conversation so that civil society is meaningfully and in political ways engaging in the redistribution of that money from where it's going right now, which in our view is unequally distributed by a set of rigged rules, to meet the aspirations of the people we serve. And I think this sits at the heart of it, partly because it's so politically sophisticated, and I'll talk about that more later if you give me a chance.
So, but in a sentence, do you have any pointers as to how you do that? Because it sounds daunting. The numbers sound daunting. How would you even go about it?
A sentence, ask where the real money is right now. There's $110 trillion sitting with 1% of the population. There's less than 70 people who own the same amount of wealth as half the planet. That might be a good place to start. But then I think just being more sophisticated about the kind of political conversation you need so that those who have money and power see it as being in their self-interest to engage with you, either because they get rewarded by doing so or frankly there are consequences to not doing so. So really excited to hear what the steering committee is going to be talking about tomorrow.
come to that. We'll come to that. Danny, I'm going to put you on the spot. I read, I think it was something, a blog post you wrote. I'm going to quote you.
Okay.
You said, "We, civil society, have been co-opted into economic and institutional processes in which we are being outwitted and outmaneuvered. We find ourselves reinforcing the social, economic, and political systems we once used to set out to transform," and so on. So OGP stands accused in a sense of being one example of that?
Well, I think I should point out that wasn't just me. That's about 30 or 40 civil society leaders, including the chief executive of Oxfam and others, who came together and wrote an open letter to fellow activists. I'm conscious, this is, I think, my 4th time here in New York this year. I live in Johannesburg, but end up traveling thousands of miles to go to these invited spaces where we as civil society, for all the right reasons, are invited into dialogue with governments. And the OGP is one such platform, one such multi-stakeholder initiative. And it's great, if you think in long historical terms, or at least in the last few decades, it's great that we now have these opportunities for dialogue. But every time I put on a suit and turn up in a meeting like this, and I look out at what's going on out there, especially what happened on Sunday, and the sort of mass mobilization by people who aren't in suits and who don't work for professionally in NGOs, I think we have a challenge here. And in a way, initiatives like OGP sit in a wider ecosystem where upstream you've got their relationship to wider global governance failures. We have the vast majority of the global governance institutions that matter to the world are structured in a way that's completely out of date, that seems completely not fit for purpose to address the real global challenges. And it's great that we have these innovations like OGP, but the real problem lies in the outdated and problematic global institutions. Downstream, the challenge is there are a few of us who are in the professional bits of civil society who have the wherewithal, the background knowledge to engage in these processes, who are at that interface. But the vast majority of citizens have no idea, live in countries where they don't necessarily have the wherewithal or the space in which they can engage on accountability issues, for example. So, for me, the opportunity of an initiative like the OGP is to push upstream and downstream in terms of wedging wider reform into global governance, using these sorts of experiences to build better global institutions, and downstream to go beyond the usual suspects to engage, the Georgians who wouldn't necessarily join an accountability NGO, but might use this opportunity to get engaged with holding their governments to account.
It's very, very hard to do. It's huge amount of work. It takes time. It takes money. Do we have the time to do that? And do we? Meaning, I think I can see the call, but I'm trying to figure out who does it. Is it feasible? Are we making a wish that's not going to be fulfilled?
I don't think we have a choice but to do it. Those of us who have the privilege to be inside the boardrooms and inside the meeting rooms have an obligation, an active obligation, I think, to ground ourselves in the sort of lived reality and the struggles of those people on whose behalf we are fighting. And that open letter was a plea, in a way, a call to action to those of us who are in this sector, that we sort of have to get better at this. And you have to be an insider and outsider. All of us in our lives do that all the time. We live contradictory lives. We play multiple roles. So, why not, when you turn up to your steering committee, play both of those roles?
Can I come in on
Yes,
that?
Robert.
Yeah, I think in addition to playing to global and local, we also have to see that engagement is not co-optation. It's very important, I think, to have the conversations and meet at the technical and political levels that are open to us, but nevertheless to maintain the independence to monitor and to say when things aren't working. So we really welcome the IRM, the 11 letters that have gone out, the vividness of the conversation, and I think the discussions you'll have tomorrow about what happens when governments backslide in their commitments, either to OGP or to the standards that need to be in place to talk about having open and transparent government. So I think it's important to do both, to maintain that independence. It's a struggle, but also to be there and to engage where we can.
So, Paul, you want to come on in on that?
Yeah, I want to tell a story which I think you like, at least. So one of my epiphany moments on the importance of this, Rakesh, was when it was the last big gathering that you did in London. and President Kikwete is on the stand, and you're there beside him, and somebody from the audience, or maybe it was the moderator, I think it was the moderator, said, "So, President Kikwete, what's it like to have Rakesh in your country constantly putting out this conversation about open government?" And Kikwete shook his head and said, "We're condemned to be together." and I remember feeling like this is the art of what we're trying to do. Nobody who has huge amounts of power and responsibility willingly exposes themselves to constant critique by those who feel that power ought to be redistributed. And so the art of engaging in this conversation about open governance is critical. And hat tip to you, I think you do that really well. But I'm not sure that we always do. And for Oxfam, our struggle right now, as we become and seek to become much more politically relevant, is to understand how in the South, and I think we're somewhat relevant, but to become more relevant in many of these countries is how to understand the art of that and to support OGP in its artfulness as well as in the science of it.
So I want to ask that question, and then I'm going to come out to you. Sometimes when I sit in these meetings, also asking the questions, what am I doing? Is this effective? Is it worth it?
And you don't even wear a suit.
And it's over there.
Okay.
Let me be honest. I think at times we as civil society haven't gotten our act together. We don't get the art and the opportunity as well. We don't organize ourselves. If I can be a little provocative, we are quick to find faults with this opportunity that's there and point out its limitations, rather than being somewhat tactical and somewhat opportunistic and say, look, here is something we've been fighting for 10, 20, 30 years. Why don't we grab this space and make it move? And so we win the kind of clean hands battle. We don't want to be touching this thing that is tainted, but we don't advance our cause. Do you have any thoughts on that? Danny?
I think it comes back to power and politics, and unfortunately, I think very few of us in civil society understand that adequately, and that's, you've got to live it often for years to get a sense of what works. Many of you will know, probably have been involved in conversations about the so-called data revolution over the last few months or years. I could spend every day of my life going to a data revolution conference of one form or another. And the sort of the worrying thing is it's so apoliticized that people think somehow that if you throw data at people, that they'll use it, they'll hold governments to account, and we'll have this accountability revolution. It doesn't happen that easily, and we've got to understand the politics. Now, the challenge and the point we made in the open letter is because many of us have become part of professionalized, bureaucratized civil society organizations, which themselves are plugged into funding and other relationships that tie their hands sometimes, we find it difficult to question that power and challenge that power and speak truth to power. And so, I'm not saying that everyone needs to do everything or that everyone needs to do the same thing, but it's just that, we need to have that understanding of how to challenge power. How do you get Kikwete into that compromised position where he can't lose you?
So, Georgie, brief comment, and then I'm going to turn here. Yeah.
Well, I think that the idea of the Open Government Partnership was to develop democracies, to give examples to those who are developing democracies. But at the same time, the OGP is the platform for the developing democracies to show themselves and give examples to develop democracies. And I think that such kind of unity gives these opportunities. And we are sharing experiences here, and at the same time, OGP action plans reflect the needs of the local needs of the population, but at the same time, it's the global initiative. And I think this sharing experience is the most important in these regards. And I think that we have the chances to give these best practices, to show that what we are planning and what we are doing and what we are achieving and developing. And I think that we should focus seriously on such kind of things. And I think we must advocate for the big nations. We are talking here about the trillions countries having lots of money and at the same time lots of power. They should be giving examples to the developing democracies. If we are thinking of the future of the OGP, this is the idea and the goal of the OGP.
But there's a lot of housekeeping that needs to be done in these countries. But I know, for example, that, I don't know if you're part of it, Georgia, that there was a group from Georgia that went to Mexico, for instance.
I was in that group.
You were part of
had
the
the
group. And
pleasure.
I thought that was fascinating, that you have Georgia and Mexico, both government and civil society jointly, both in Georgia and in Mexico, really trying to get into the nuts and bolts of how do we make this freedom of information work. I think that's a kind of example of what you're talking about. Okay, Robin, you have a...
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on this question you asked. Are we sort of holier than thou? And does that mean that by staying outside we can't make things happen? And does that keep us clean? I'm not sure. I think that I welcome what Sunita talked about in terms of having some space for innovation and making mistakes. Because if I look at really what we're trying to achieve with open government, we need to talk more to the private sector. And that's a really tricky issue. You know, talk about risk of co-optation and risk of getting dirty in the process and not knowing when to back in and move out. But I think we have a lot of examples from multi-stakeholder frameworks of sitting at the table with business, and we need to do that better both here in this area of open government and in other areas as well, because we simply won't solve the problems by looking only to government, civil society. We've got to bring the private sector in.
My friend Nikhil, I think he's here, he talks about how governments don't really run countries anymore, that it's often corporations who do. So with that, let me invite either a brief comment or a brief question. And there are microphones, so if you just wave and we'll get to you. Who wants to start? Over there. Yes. And that table? Yeah. If you just perhaps tell us your name and before you give us your comment.
Am I on?
Yeah, now you're on.
Hi, my name is Nenna. I come from the internet. Well, I work for the Web Foundation, and I'm mostly online. My CEO would have loved to be here, Angelema, who most of you know already, and she's really, really sad she's not here, so accept her excuses, and she's participating online, really. Okay, quite a number of things. Wonderful lady wearing my type of dress. We'll need to have a photo later on. Open Data Charter. I'm from Africa, and I move around. And Anne wanted me to fly this idea with you because the Web Foundation also is co-chair of the working group. How can we hold states accountable for what we bring to them? And she wanted us to think more on an open data charter that the OGP working group on open data could work on.
So what about the open data charter would you specifically is really important in your view?
What's important is that we now hold people to commitments that have been made. It's been raised here. What do we do when states do not keep to this commitment? But we're looking particularly commitments in accountability, budgets and spending, government contracts, land registries, company registries, and ensure that data revolution is truly revolutionary. I've been in contact with the panel, the data rev panel that's been put up. The meeting is tomorrow, but it's closed. There is going to be a kind of town hall meeting in case anyone here is interested. But finally, where do we want to put accountability, access to information, and free expression in the next SDGs? It's not very clear there.
16.
Governor, it's bundled up in the 16, and it's going round and round. I'm happy to speak to it. We are happy at the Web Foundation to speak to anyone, and that's why I've been here for the past 8 days, walking around, hitting the streets of New York, talking to anyone about the importance of mainstreaming this in the SDGs. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. If you can, we'll take a couple of comments and then I'll come back to you. Let me go on this side. Julie.
Hi, Can you hear me? Julie McCarthy with the Open Society Foundations. So I was really interested to hear the idea brought up about how OGP could engage with the private sector more. And as many of us know who have been involved with OGP from the beginning, this is sort of a recurring cyclical comment that we all make, and then it sort of goes by the wayside and we return to it a year later. And so I'd love to take the opportunity now to just get the esteemed panel's thoughts on some concrete ways that going forward OGP might seek to engage the private sector, which is extremely important. Thanks.
Thanks, Julie. If you have a point that's similar to the previous one that you must speak on, then put up 2 hands. Okay. All right. Let me turn to you, sir.
Yeah, Anders. Sorry.
Yeah, Anders Petersen, Open Knowledge. Just a quick comment on Julie on your question. I think corporate accountability should definitely be one of the things that the private sector could bring to the table. We could talk about open supply chains when we talk about garment sector workers. We could talk about corporate accountability, real corporate accountability with transfer pricing and tax flows. OGP is not really at the center of those conversations yet. They happen at OECD and other forums. So one of the things concretely that could really raise this would be to get some real tough commitments in there in some of the action plans. Beneficial ownership, real transactional spending transparency, some of these things that go beyond just releasing a budget. And if we talk in Global South, this is how much money goes to the actual school, not the school district, but the actual school. All these kind of things, those can help address it, but I think definitely private sector should be in there.
Thank you, really terrific things. Is there anybody who wants to speak specifically on private sector? No, okay. Let me take 2 more. I see Sarah and Gladwell, and then I'll come back to in the second round. So.
Thank you. Sarah Mendelson, CSIS. I want to get to this issue of the political versus the non-political, because I think it's really a tension that runs through a lot of parts of OGP. I was at the African Leaders Summit in Washington in early August at the OGP panel, and it was fascinating to see on the dais the young Tunisian activist talking about OGP as really essential to the revolution that went on in Tunisia, that this was about the freedom of information, the demand for accountability. It just was absolutely, completely political. And then there was the South African government official who was really focused on paper procurement. And that tension is really there. And so when you talk about the march on Sunday, my head goes to the march in Moscow, where thousands of people came out demanding accountability, and incredibly brave, very difficult. And the folks further west in Ukraine, I mean, that entire struggle is about people wanting a fair, just government, and certain governments not wanting that to happen. And they view this as intensely political. So if we're not on some level acknowledging that, you know, we are in a struggle of opening and closing space. It is happening all over the world right now. So I encourage the steering committee, to the extent that you can, and I have been in one of those meetings, I know the challenges of it, you know, be brave, understand the kind of struggle that is going on and that you're a part of, because ultimately OGP has the possibility of being tremendously powerful. It's organic on some level. It's reflecting an organic movement.
Thanks. Gladwell.
Thank you. My question actually links directly onto what Sarah was just saying. I think one of the core issues which occupies us in countries like Kenya is this issue of the closing space and the nature of power and politics. And when I hear this conversation, I really think, you know, I don't know where we can find answers. I certainly don't think, you know, speaking about the holier than thou issue, that we've done everything right, or that we've explored all the spaces and the little crevices and cracks of opportunity that have been there. But I really, I'm concerned about a certain level of pragmatism not being seen as appeasing, sorry to use the word, as appeasing governments, which in some ways have demonstrated in quite a few ways that they really have no deep commitment to openness. So it's great to have all the technical examples, great to have all the best practices, but the nub of the thing is really about the nature of power and how power is gained, particularly in countries like mine, Kenya, and how power is kept and how wealth is gained and increased. And I'm sure we can always do more in terms of talking to those who are willing to speak to us, etc. But at the end of the day, I think we really have a very, very hard nut to crack in countries like India, Kenya, Ethiopia, Russia, etc., where we have very sophisticated governments who are able to mobilize the rhetoric of openness and still have a very, very, very retrogressive agenda. Thank you.
Okay, I see it. Two finger here, quickly.
I'd also like to follow up. I'm Ken Wallach with the National Democratic Institute. Follow up a little bit on Sarah's remarks, too, as it comes to politics.
Let's get the microphone so they can hear you on the...
To follow up a little with about Sarah's remark on politics, and that has to do with accountability mechanisms. Sunita began by talking about her contract with her mother, but ultimately you can't fire your mother.
My kids might try.
You're supposed to be able to fire your government, however, if they don't deliver. And so the question that I have is, how do you view accountability mechanisms in this regard? And secondly, how do you expand this to a larger political class? When you're dealing with governments, you're usually dealing with one elected official. And the question is, how do you broaden this to a political class that would include both ruling party, opposition parties, so you ensure the commitments will continue if the government falls and then a new government takes over. So how do you broaden this, viewing it through a political lens,
Yes.
and to include a broader political class in the country?
Thank you. Really terrific questions. What I'm going to do is come back here, ask you to be fairly brief so we can come back. I see if we can address the political question and including the politics of data in there. Paul, you're raring to go.
Yes, I am. I love it. It's great that we're asking this question collectively. Okay, so it is a political conversation, but the problem with politics and talking about power, twofold. One, you can very quickly, if you're not artful, sound sloppy ideologues, I can't even say it, and people stop listening to you because what they're assuming is that you carry a particular political agenda. So how do you avoid that? One. Two, as you get to talk more explicitly about politics, you're talking more about power, and those very same actors that you spoke eloquently about see what you're doing and want to shut you down. So it creates risks for country presence. The 90 countries that Oxfam works in, if we start saying what we have as a political agenda, we may not be there very long. So how do we address those two challenges? Don't sound like sloppy ideologues and actually stay in the political conversation. What we did for years was engage in the transparency conversation because it was so politically benign. We just walked around the place saying, we're not trying to upset the apple cart, we're just counting the apples, and everyone let us do it. That's why revenue transparency succeeds, it's why foundations fund it, and we've all had this great love fest with the transparency agenda precisely because it allows us to be political without sounding stupid. The challenge for us now is that we're moving from the where's all the money to how does it actually get spent. It's much closer to the core things that these political actors care about, expenditure accountability. So Ken, your question is lovely, but partly it's lovely because if we use words like accountability and social accountability, we will find a way to walk that gentle line that moves us into what is a redistributive question, which is very scary, with language that will give people greater comfort. And that's the challenge. Just one quick thing to link the private sector thing. It's the same issue. It's about looking at where their incentives are. In the room next door, we've got 9 of the 10 largest, Oxfam's hosting a thing by coincidence, 9 of the 10 largest food companies in the world. And what we basically said to them, you're not transparent enough, but we know you've no interest to be transparent. But guess what? We're going to compare you, Coke, to you, Pepsi. And we're going to shame whichever one is less transparent. We're going to shame you, General Mills, which makes one breakfast cereal, for being less transparent than Kellogg, or working on women's issues or on climate. It's by appealing to their incentives, which is to look good, that you get the private sector to engage. So they very much have an agenda, but it's got to be driven by where they come from. And I think we've got to take some of that kind of thinking to why would the president of Kenya care about being a better participant in OGP than his neighbors.
Sure. Rob.
Yeah, I mean, in defense of transparency, I think, of course, that we need to connect transparency to meaningful accountability. But I also think we shouldn't take it for granted in all cases. And I think that what we need to look at, and this maybe gets to the questions about the sustainability of the agenda when the regime changes, is we need to build this as a cultural issue. We need to see that the bar is moving, that there is no going back in terms of corporate transparency and government transparency and so on. So I think embedding the idea that we not only need to know how the money's spent, but where does the money come from? So this is also important when one looks at good governance and anti-corruption. You know, how did that wealth, how was it generated in the first place? Is it clean money? I think that's an important part of the equation that's coming up. Maybe segueing to private sector, Julie, and some of the questions about what can we do to incentivize business to come to the table and be a part of the conversation. I think we've had a good run for showing the costs to business of bad environments, bad places to invest, conflict, corruption, et cetera, around the world. What we haven't shown is the cost-benefit of clean, of being good, of being transparent, of being an active participant. So we do need an evidence base to bring companies on board. But above all, I think these win-win type scenarios. So procurement, open contracting, integrity pacts, where government and business both have something to gain from the transparency and accountability agenda. And I think those are concrete areas we could work to get business involved.
Great. Do you guys have a brief comment you want to come in on?
Well, I think coming back to Georgia and the political issue, the last question is very much, Georgia is a very good example of this, because during the implementation of the action plan, first action plan, there were political changes in Georgia. And the main grounding of these changes were the lack of transparency and accountability from the government. Georgia has developed the infrastructure, economy significantly after the change of the government in 2003, but they were lacks in human rights issues, accountability and transparency, and the demand of the population was to enhance exactly human rights and transparency issues. And here we use this opportunity to advocate for the changes, for developing OGP in Georgia. The grounding was that, you know, like the demand is coming from the people, and your government should be more accountable, transparent, and supporting public participation. And here they were very, very supportive in these regards, because there was really demand from the people. It's very rare in the countries, especially of the post-Soviet states, and we use this opportunity, and this is how this cooperation with the government developed on OGP issues, and it was a very good momentum that we used a bit.
So I think that's a really important point, that in a sense what gave life and energy is the demand to the OGP. You know, the OGP is otherwise just a kind of framework, and
that's right.
And the demand was crucial. Brief comment.
Yeah, I think it's time to take a step back and evaluate all of these voluntary multi-stakeholder initiatives to which states participate, and ask the question: what has been the political value add? What has been the political price that the closed government partnership, the 160 countries or whatever, 130 countries that haven't been in, or even those 64, what has happened in tangible terms for governments or political actors who've refused to comply, not just internationally in intergovernmental politics, but at the domestic level? Because then you get into the question of where is transparency turning into accountability? And I think that's, when we talk about civic space, I mean, this is core business for Civicus. We haven't done the analysis for OGP members, but we did last year look at the Busan Partnership, 151 countries that signed an agreement that included a commitment to protect the enabling environment for civil society. We've catalogued 420 different instances in which 82 of those signatories have infringed some aspect of civil society or the enabling environment. Now, where's the accountability there? And we have to start out, I think, Vanessa and colleagues at TAI are starting to think about on this issue of civic space, how can we sort of be more clear about the threshold for participation in these sorts of multi-stakeholder initiatives. Just very quickly on business, please beware of what I call Pullmanitis, which is in international development when people go in search of willing business partners to engage, they encounter Paul Pullman from Unilever, who's a wonderful man, but unfortunately there are only a few Paul Pullmans out there and few companies who are genuinely interested in these sorts of things. And I keep going to the same meetings with the same corporate actors, and we've got to find a way of reaching beyond. It's much like the OGP. How do you broaden the 64 out? How do you get more than a few, far-sighted business leaders to engage with these sorts of things?
All right. Do we have how many hands? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So 5. So if you can be brief, so I can take all of you, and then because we have about 10 minutes left. Let me actually start with you.
Oh, hi. Thank you. My name is Namhla. I am from African Monitor. I live in South Africa. I'm going to make very brief comments, but there's going to be 3 of them. I think the one is a really direct question to the panel members. One of the things that have really been concerning in our work on accountability, and particularly coming up with creative ways of putting systems in place where there can be accountability from governments, is that what tends to happen is governments become really sophisticated in building outward accountability. In other words, they become really good in writing brilliant reports. I remember the last OGP meeting we had, I think in the UK, where South Africa had a brilliant report on what was going on in the country. And citizens, rather civil society who was sitting in the room were saying, but where? There has not been a conversation about these issues. How are you starting to build a movement that's ensuring that this is not a report writing process, but really encouraging downward accountability systems so that the countries are not just aiming to look good internationally, but are actually beginning to really look good on the ground? So that's the first one.
One more point.
One more point. All right, let me choose between the two. SDGs. One of the things that have really surprised me is the really incredibly strong resistance to the accountability conversation in the room. There's literally a 50-50 split between countries who are saying we don't want anything said on accountability, and countries, even basic things like access to information. So if we are moving forward in this agenda, how do we deal with things like that where we have opportunities to make global commitments on accountability, but in forums that are incredibly important, there is this resistance. And what has this movement particularly been doing to change perspectives there at the UN when we're talking about accountability? Goal 16.
Thank you very much. Let me go there, Martin.
Hi, Martin from Amidia. So very briefly, I worry we do ourselves a disservice if we lump all voluntary multi-stakeholder initiatives together. Most multi-stakeholder initiatives define the boundaries of conversation. So EITI, you sit at the table, you talk about a very specific type of engagement with extractive industries. IATI, the same on aid. I'll stop there. I think from a political perspective, what we haven't seized and realized yet is the breadth of issues that OGP opens as a conversation and the breadth of the political space that we're opening. And I think from an advocacy perspective, we're not good enough as thinking of the OGP action plans as action-forcing events from advocacy. So my question is, global civil society, global campaigners at the table, how are you thinking of using OGP in your global campaign? So how is Oxfam thinking of, we've got public registries of beneficial owners thanks to OGP in the UK. How is Oxfam thinking of scaling that up to 15, 25 countries? What are the OGP countries of the 64 that are ripe to get engaged on beneficial ownership? TI, same question around the G20. How can we caucus the OGP members in the G20 to push for issues? The political space that we have now in OGP is so wide, so broad compared to other multi-stakeholder initiatives. I really think it's a different beast that we have, and we haven't quite understood and conceptualized it yet. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. There were some other hands over there.
Hi,
Okay, yeah.
Joachim Nahum from the International Law and Policy Institute. I was responsible for the first national report for Norway. My question is, how do you create these national narratives? I think Paul's point was, rather than having the countries come to the platform, how do you create platforms in countries? And the word art was used also. How do you use art and innovation at country level to make this relevant, rather than it's just a question of compliance for countries for global standards without having a conversation with civil society? Norway actually represents a paradox in this case, in that it is generally a good performer on transparency and accountability, but a little bit of a laggard when it comes to OGP. What the government is doing now is focusing a lot on how do we comply with these commitments and basically are compliant with OGP, rather than seeing that this is actually an interesting platform to have a national discussion. There's lots happening in Norway relevant to OGP, but it's just not happening in terms of conversation. Nobody knows about it. The government hasn't spoken about it at the national level. It will travel internationally and speak at regional and global fora, but it doesn't have this conversation at the national level. And it just hasn't been able to create this narrative, this art and innovation that you're speaking about. So I think it's just as much about global civic campaigns as it is about national narratives and this sort of art and creation that you mentioned. So any recommendations on this would be welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. Chris Underwood from an initiative called Making Your Voices Count. I've really enjoyed both Danny and Paul in particular giving us some quite challenging thoughts in terms of the actual reality of perhaps structures that are outdated and the role of politics and power. But I do just wonder, listening to the debate, which has been very rich, it's very much about national and international structures, when the reality is that the relationship that most citizens have with their government is, of course, at local level. I was in Kenya last week, and a headmaster told me that because there wasn't, and I quote, a strong man in his village, nobody would ever listen to him about his school. And so my question to the panel is really, how, given that's the level that those blockages really exist at, how do we take initiatives, rather like Martin's point, I suppose, earlier, how do we take initiatives like OGP or any other and really start to invest in learning about what works at local level rather than national level? So rather than Kikwete having to put up with you, Rakesh, as valuable as that is, but how does that then translate into actual change at local level that affects real people's lives in real ways?
Right next to you, Chris, Aruna.
I'm Aruna Roy. I'm from India. Peculiar circumstance that the government of India is not part of the OGP, but we have 10 million users of the right to information in India, and we have had 40 RTI users and activists killed in the last 3 years because they've raised controversial questions. So I come with a very mixed agenda to the OGP. We have very telling ways in which the people define the changes in government. In the beginning, we were fighting against license Raj. License Raj meant government controls. Today, we talk about the corporate Raj, company Raj. That's what they call it. So the definitions and divisions are, to some extent, artificial for persons who are fighting the system for justice, for equality, for rights. The government, we cannot dismantle the rhetoric. It's very difficult. With 10 million users all over India, I know we are 1.2 billion people, but 10 million is a huge number. And we cut across all classes, all sections, all castes, all cities and rural areas. Very difficult to dismantle it. But they keep the rhetoric, but dismantle the content. That's what's happening in India today. They're co-opting the vocabulary, but not giving us our rights. And how do they do it? And I just want to place these few issues in front of you because there will be second generation issues in many countries. The first thing is they've started questioning our right to question. So if you question, and a very legitimate question often gets put in the context of extreme politics, terrorist politics, of any of the political hues that may be convenient to damn you with. They also resist your questions by making the whole process dysfunctional within the system. So we have to fight that. The second thing is that also restricting places of congregation. So these are all done through democratic government orders, through processes. So you have to fight for places to congregate. And in many cases, like India, you have to protest on the streets. If you don't protest on the streets, you do not get your rights. So you have to get together. Those areas are being are lessening. There's no real legitimacy in outside the legal system for to differ and dissent. There are all kinds of forces unleashed on people who offer an alternative public or economic opinion in my country today. The resistance that has come to be demands justice. So what we'll now have to look at is, does transparency and accountability lead to justice? And if it's stopped, where do we stand?
So I saw Jamie there, and I wish we could go on, but I think Jamie will be are you ceding your time? Okay, all right. Well, if you make it brief, we'll take both of you. In the meantime, before you speak, we will have 1 minute for each one of you. And so you'll be able to say one interesting thing. So think of what that is after these two folks are speaking. But listen to them as well. All right, sir.
Thank you. Ian Levine from Human Rights Watch, thank you. Paul, you asked the question of how can we address the nexus of politics and power, the nub of the issue, without appearing to be sloppy ideologues. And I think the lady, Arun, I think it was from India, I think her question really addressed that. She said, will transparency and accountability lead to justice? Now, I would actually argue it the other way around. How can we talk about transparency and accountability without first talking about justice and rights? Without the freedom of expression and association, people will not have the courage to speak out. Without a free press and an independent judiciary, we will not be able to hold governments accountable. So my argument would be that we can and must use the international human rights framework to address these issues. It's not sloppy, it's international, it's clear, and it is an essential mechanism and set of standards to allow the open government debate to really move forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Jamie?
Thank you. Just one quick point on data revolution, which is too easily dismissed. I would, and I know, Danny, you didn't really mean to do that. And full disclosure, one is hosting a data revolution breakfast right now as we speak, but I'm here. So I partially agree with you.
Touche.
Actually, the data revolution level of conversation that is most exciting is the local level one, to the point that you made. And that's, I think, where we need to try and focus it and leverage it, and where it could have really great value. The point I really want to make, though, which is incredibly obvious, it has been made at every similar gathering, probably since the dawn of global civil society, which is, but to your point, Rakesh, what are we doing about advocacy, training, and capacity, and learning how to do it better? You would expect incredibly talented, articulate people to be gathered at a UN General Assembly week in New York with such an august panel and great food from the Ford Foundation. But it isn't as strong as soon as we get to many national levels and subnational levels. And it should be stronger at those levels. And we're not as organized as we should be in that area, and we've long known that it's a big problem, and we don't seem to be very good at organizing ourselves to deal with it. And our opposition is very well organized. So what are we doing about that collectively and individually? And what is the OGP helping civil society do about that? Because it seems like the most important, a very important single action item. There's lots of talented people here, for example, in this room, with a lot of experience about how to run successful, multi-year, complicated advocacy strategies across many countries. How do we work together better, but also how do we train better our colleagues at national level? And learn from them, of course.
Thanks, Jamie. Unfortunately, I have to turn now back to the panel, stop the conversation there. Lots of things said. I don't know how, I don't envy your task, but I just advise that you pick one issue. And if there is in your remarks any pointed advice for OGP, for those who are the members of the steering committee taking it forward, please include that. So you have 1 minute each. Who wants to start?
I'll start. Fine.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much for the very interesting comments and questions. I think I'd pick up on two things. The first is how do we get down to local level? My colleague Ilim, I think, was here, and the claim of success and work that they're most proud of in Indonesia has to do with participatory budgeting at local level and monitoring of school provision. So I really think that there is the opportunity that OGP can demonstrate local level impact, but we do need to learn from social accountability tools, and we do need to ask the question locally, what's the most important issue in this country in terms of open government? In some cases, it's things like security, and they haven't been very committed to via the OGP process. We have to make people's human security possible in order to live in open societies. On the challenges for OGP as a political space, that has to do with, I think, it's youth. It's a young institution. I mean, the opportunities for it need to evolve. And we do need to look, as I've discussed in the past, where we can leverage OGP at global discussion, at regional discussion, and so on. But we then need to decide as civil society where we may need to opt out and where we may need to react to politics, where politics restrict just too much.
Thanks, Robert. Georgia.
Well, I would like to respond to this very important question related to public engagement in OGP. Populations, how local it is reflected. I think that this is the main challenge of locally to develop OGP in the countries like Georgia, for example, because for the action plan, the second action plan, we had the whole process of public consultation, and we had the platform, national coordination mechanism to work on this, and it was a long process to meet different groups of the people in Georgia with different priorities and pick up those of the most important, which is global in Georgia, is really important to develop, and this is how the action plan was drafted. But we are challenging now the process of involving the whole population in Georgia. If we count like what is the awareness raising in the country, it's probably less than 1% knows about the OGP. But this should be the beneficial. It's not just the sexy words, democracy, accountability, public engagement. This should be really beneficial to those who really need it. This is the platform to develop public benefits to this. And I think this is the most important challenge. And I think international recognition and, as I mentioned, the big powers to be supportive to the OGP is really important. In Georgia, we use the situation when the President Obama, in his address to the Georgian government, spoke about the importance of the government of Georgia's dedication to the OGP, and it was one of the most important advocacy tools that we use. That like our main partners, international partners, are really following and supporting us in OGP, and you should be dedicated to this. How well you are supportive to this, we will have support internationally when we need it. So I think the challenge is public awareness on OGP, to know people what the importance of this topic is.
Thank you. Paul.
So, I think Oxfam is asking some of the right questions about staying relevant to activism and about grappling with power and politics, but I'm not sure that I think we're moving pretty fast. I'm not sure we're moving fast enough, and I'm not sure the answer to Jamie's question is what we're doing in part, which is training people as fast as we can to be more effective. We find increasingly that we are on catch-up and we don't have time to train. I was a trainer on advocacy and human rights for 10 years, and I often felt the best work we did was, or that I got to be exposed with, was learning from somebody who was ahead of me. When I've seen Oxfam do good stuff, Cambodia trying to keep the NGO law from being passed, but doing it behind closed doors, organizing marches in the Dominican Republic, getting farmers in Ghana to protest about more oil money being spent on agriculture. It's been by very quickly understanding, where I do agree with you, Jamie, is the nexus between tech, data, youth activism, social media, where are they moving, and getting on that journey as quickly as we can and being helpful. Martin, we're trying to do that in different ways in the 46 countries. If Oxfam stays relevant in these countries, it will because we take a very disaggregated approach to what's possible in each of the contexts where we're working in. I love the call to be thinking about justice explicitly and rights first, but we often can't do that. We have to be smart about how much open space there is to move the government in those directions. But we're on catch-up, and this is a great platform for us to accelerate the catch-up. But I don't apologize for that. I think that's where we ought to be, catching up as fast as we can.
Thanks.
I'm a bit more optimistic than Martin about the potential for these multi-stakeholder initiatives, or even just values-based or commitment-based voluntary state initiatives. Community of Democracies, the Busan Partnership. I used to work at the Commonwealth, which is probably the oldest commitment-based multi-state partnership. It's hopeless, but it's still old. So I think there is scope within each of these and many others to do the sorts of things that you're trying to do within the OGP. But the challenge, and this is my answer, my joint answer to Jamie, Ian, Aruna, and Zhao Kim, which is similar to what these guys have just said, which is almost where you had me start, which is we're only going to realize the potential of these initiatives if we can do the heavy lifting in terms of building that culture of accountability, the accountability revolution, if you will. And that's, how do we get more Rakeshas in Tanzania? And how do we build a new generation of people who are empowered, who are able, who understand evidence? In our constituency, it would be interesting to ask, we've got members in 140 countries, how many of our civil society members know about the OGP? Curious. But more importantly, how many of them are in this area of trying to use evidence and data in a more creative way to do accountability. And Jamie's right, I was tongue-in-cheek in part about the data revolution. We're actually spending a huge amount of time trying to contribute our little bit to that heavy lift, and it's called the Big Development Data Shift, thedatashift.org. And the idea is, how do we, the question we've been asking ourselves is, for the sorts of civil society actors that aren't in rooms like this, that don't know what the OGP is, how do you start to build the capacity and the interest in the first place in using not just the evidence but tools and platforms like these to do accountability at the national level? And without that investment, we're not going to realize the potential of these spaces.
Well, I've learned a huge, huge amount. Let me just say a couple of things in closing before I hand over to Paul Masson. You mentioned evidence. We haven't had the opportunity in this meeting to talk about the independent report mechanism. Joe Foti over there is the guy who runs it. We have a lot of data. I think it's really worth trawling through and analyzing. There's some stuff that Joe and his team have done, but I think there's much more that can be done. The full data set, I think, is available online. But I think we should really look at that and try to learn where things are working and not. So I'd encourage you to do that. I'm no expert on multilateral initiatives, but my hunch is that what Martin Tisner said is right, that there are some features about the OGP that allow us to do certain things in ways that are unprecedented. But it will only work, as Sunita says, if we grab it and make it work for us. So to the extent to which many of us in this room have been fighting certain important battles for a long time, I'd urge you to look at OGP, and if it makes sense for you to make it work, and we have a terrific support unit that can kind of guide you and help you and be there to support you in that process. So with that, can I ask you to give a big hand to Paul, Georgie, Robin, and Dan. Thank you. Paul Masson, the civil society coordinator who actually organizes all this stuff. Over to you.
Thanks, Rakesh, for moderating that lively debate, interesting debate. A few final thoughts before we let you go into the madness of Manhattan during the UNGA week. I'm sure you have at least 17 other appointments today. I want to give you a very quick snapshot of the new OGP 4-year strategy. If you haven't already, there are copies at the tables. When you walk out, take a copy with you. The new strategy builds squarely on sort of the core of OGP. The core of OGP is not changing. It's about a domestic accountability mechanism where civil society and government create a dialogue and develop commitments together and deliver them. And that domestic mechanism is strengthened by an international dimension, an international platform where we support and connect and inspire the actors that actually have to deliver at the national level. We won't change that. That will all stay the same. What we will do is a lot. And I'll pick out 3 things of the strategy that I want to share with you today. One, first, and probably the most important one, is still getting the basics right, getting the basics of OGP right. That means providing core support to both government and civil society in understanding and making use of what OGP is. And the sharing of the examples, like Georgie was doing here, the national examples, I think is extremely important for that, for understanding how you can use it. Second, to keep improving the OGP accountability mechanisms. The IRM is great, it's out there. There's a lot of information and data, like Rakesh is saying, but we can explore it more, we can use it more. But it also means that the response policy that hopefully the steering committee will adapt tomorrow is going to be a very important tool for us as civil society to use to keep the countries stick to the values of OGP and not slide on civic space. And it also means some small things on, for example, important for civil society, improving the guidelines for engagement between government and civil society. So that's the first one. Getting the basics right, hopefully with that getting better action plans, broader action plans, and more ambitious action plans. The second one is strengthening OGP as an organization and as a platform. One of the most exciting things, I think, about the new strategy is that it really lays out the focus and the plan for OGP as an organization as well. Next year we'll start establishing ourselves as an organization, independent organization here in the US. The civil society engagement team, my team, will be integrated into the support unit. We'll get more people on board that will help us, and people that will actually be close in the regions, close to the country where it's happening, understanding what is happening, and with the ability to help civil society use OGP. So that's a very important one. And a platform, it's been said a lot today, OGP is a platform. But for it to be a platform that delivers, we need you on that platform to shape it, to use it, to help us strengthen it. And I really like, Paul, what you were saying, it's also a platform for acceleration. But to use it in that way, we have to get the art of engagement right. So that's the second one. And the third one, very briefly, I think we have to continue with learning and innovation. That's what makes OGP also inspiring and energetic. We're doing a lot around that, which is already great. The webinars are popular, the regional events are strong, the global summits are really good, but we have to do more on learning, on communication, on capturing these experiences. And finally, in that domain, we have to continue innovating at the country level on how we can broaden OGP by bringing in different levels of government. What about local government, state level government? By bringing in different parts of government, like the judiciary. And some of you that are following OGP more closely at the country level will know that a lot of really interesting stuff is already happening there. So those three things for me are the most important part of the strategy. Personally, for me and for my team, Civil Society Engagement Team, very important is to continue the conversation we started today with you. OGP, even if it's growing, it's still a very lean and small team. And to be able to deliver on its potential at the country level, we need organizations and networks and coalitions that have legs on the ground, that know what's happening at the local level, that can help us turn the potential into reality. So that's the conversation we'll continue with you. Not because we want to grow OGP by using you, but because OGP is an opportunity for you to make a difference in the places and on the topics you care about. So that's it on the strategy. We've heard a lot today about the questions we still have, about the things that have to improve, about where we're not there yet. But today is also OGP's 3-year anniversary. So it's also a day to celebrate its success so far, to celebrate its potential. And I hope to see many of you this afternoon again at the UN building, together with a lot of distinguished civil society leaders and heads of state, with the first ever Open Government Awards, with a full program that really sort of will give you a rich idea of where OGP is at 3 years' time. Rest me to thank the Ford Foundation for hosting us today and offering us this beautiful room. Apologies to the panel for not seeing it. To the speakers for their thoughts and insights, and to you for showing up so early on a Wednesday morning. Thank you.